The morning my brother stood in my father's kitchen and told 30 people that Raymond Calloway had left him everything, I was 7 feet away holding the casserole dish I'd driven 2 hours to bring. Chicken and rice. Dad's favorite. I set it on the counter without a word. I had learned, across 38 years of being Raymond Calloway's eldest daughter, that the most dangerous thing you could do in a room full of people watching you for a reaction was give them one. My name is Nora Calloway. My father died on a Tuesday in February. He went quietly, the way he'd lived, without making a fuss, without asking anyone to inconvenience themselves, in the bedroom of the farmhouse on Harlan Road where he'd lived for 42 years. I was there. I had been there most nights for 8 months, driving 40 minutes each way from my apartment in Dayton after my workday ended, sleeping in the narrow guest bed down the hall, waking at 2 in the morning whenever the oxygen machine made a sound it shouldn't. I rearranged my client schedule at the accounting firm 3 times. I used 11 of my 14 vacation days before April arrived. My brother Daniel came from Cincinnati the afternoon after Dad died. He pulled up in a new Lexus I hadn't seen before, wearing a blazer like he'd come from a business meeting, smelling like a hotel bar and a very specific kind of urgency. He thanked the hospice nurse by the wrong name. And then he walked straight to my father's study and started opening drawers. I need you to hold on to that image. Because everything that happened over the next 6 weeks began in that study, in a drawer my brother believed was empty. If you're just finding this story, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe right now. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love knowing where in the world you're watching from. Now let me take you back to the beginning. My father was not a complicated man. He was a farmer who became a handyman who became, over the course of 4 decades, a man who owned 47 acres in Mercer County, Ohio, a farmhouse paid off since 1998, and a reputation in 3 counties as someone whose word was better than any contract. He grew up genuinely poor, 6 children, 2 bedrooms outside of Coldwater, shoes passed from oldest to youngest until the soles gave out. When Raymond Calloway said something was yours, he had thought about it the way only someone who once owned nothing thinks about ownership. He meant it the way people mean things they've carried a long time. Daniel and I grew up on the Harlan Road farm. I am 5 years older, which matters more than people remember when they're assigning family roles. By the time Daniel was 12 and charming every adult in the county, I was 17 and already keeping the farm's books in a green spiral notebook I balanced to the penny every Sunday. When Daniel was in high school winning speech competitions and being recruited by 3 university programs, I was working 25 hours a week at the grain elevator to pay for my associate's degree in accounting. Nobody asked me to. Nobody told me not to. The pattern was clean and quiet. Daniel got the warmth and the attention and the belief. I got the ledger and the spare key and the understanding, never quite spoken, that I was the one who would be there when things needed handling. I accepted it the way you accept the climate. It simply was. Daniel left for Cincinnati at 26 with an idea for a real estate investment firm, leveraged acquisitions, distressed asset portfolios, equity repositioning, language I could follow well enough to recognize that it was sound in theory and optimistic in execution. He borrowed $30,000 from Dad for startup costs. A formal loan, a piece of paper, 2 signatures notarized at the county courthouse. Dad showed me the document with quiet pride. I noticed the interest rate was 4% over 7 years, which was so far below market as to be a gift dressed as a loan. I said nothing. It wasn't my money and it wasn't my place. The firm did well for a while. Daniel wore the blazer and the Lexus and called Dad on Sunday mornings. He came home for Christmas and Thanksgiving and filled the kitchen with laughter the way only Daniel could, the way a fire fills a room even after the wood is gone. I came home for the holidays and did the dishes and drove Dad to his cardiac follow-up on the 27th because the clinic closed the week of Christmas and he kept forgetting to reschedule. The loan was never repaid. Not one payment across 7 years. Dad stopped mentioning it around year 3. By my calculation, with accrued interest, the balance at the time of his death would have been approximately $37,400. I did not forget the number. I never forgot numbers. That was, as it turned out, going to matter. Dad's heart had been unreliable since 2019, not dramatically, not in the way that lands a man in the ICU overnight, but in the slow, grinding way that reorders your entire life around medication schedules and cardiology appointments and the sound of labored breathing you learn to interpret from across the house. His cardiologist was Dr. Osei at the Mercer Health Clinic. I knew Dr. Osei's direct line. I knew the names of both nurses in his office who handled Dad's prescription refills. I had a spreadsheet on my laptop titled Dad Medical, 2022 Forward that tracked every appointment, every lab result, every medication, every dosage, every refill date. When Daniel arrived the afternoon after Dad died and the hospice nurse mentioned Dr. Osei's coordination with palliative care, Daniel said, "Right, his primary care doctor. Dr. Osei is a cardiologist. He has never been anyone's primary care physician. It is not a minor distinction. It is the difference between someone who was present and someone who was not. I want to be fair to my brother. I have spent enough years reviewing estate documents for clients at the firm to understand that grief and guilt and money can fuse into something that looks like greed from the outside but is often something more complicated and human underneath. I tried to hold on to that understanding across the days after the funeral. I held on to it for 4 days. It lasted until Thursday. On Thursday, Daniel asked to meet at the house. I drove out from Dayton, let myself in with the spare key I'd had since 2020, and found Daniel already there at the kitchen table with a manila envelope, a legal pad, and a man I didn't recognize, approximately 60, gray-haired, wearing a sport coat over a checked shirt, carrying himself with the careful, planted stillness of someone who had sat through many difficult conversations and knew how to take up exactly the right amount of space. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me keep bringing you stories like this one. Daniel introduced the man as a colleague. He didn't say his name. He didn't say what kind of colleague. He poured himself coffee from a pot he had not made. He offered me none. "Nora," he said, "I've been going through Dad's papers. There's some things we need to talk through." He pushed the manila envelope across the table. Inside was a 2-page document. A will. My father's full name at the top, a Dayton notary stamp at the bottom, dated March of 2021. I read it without touching it more than I needed to. The language was standard boilerplate. Raymond Jerome Calloway, being of sound mind, did hereby leave the entirety of his estate, including the Harlan Road property and all associated land, the contents of both savings accounts, and his union pension and retirement funds, to his son, Daniel Raymond Calloway. I was mentioned once, as the recipient of her mother's china set and an assortment of personal effects at the executor's discretion. Daniel was named executor. I read it a second time. My face gave nothing away. I set the document on the table. "What's the total estate value?" I asked. Daniel glanced at the man in the sport coat, who remained perfectly still. "We're still assessing," Daniel said. I already knew. I had been managing Dad's financial accounts with his full knowledge and blessing since 2020. Both savings accounts. The online access he'd asked me to set up because his eyesight made the small print on the paper statements difficult. The farmhouse and 47 acres had been appraised informally 2 years earlier when Dad had briefly considered a reverse mortgage and then changed his mind. The appraised value had been $480,000. The two savings accounts together held $112,000 at last statement. The Union Retirement Fund had approximately $89,000. Total estate value, conservatively, $681,000. Daniel, under the document on the table, stood to inherit every dollar of it. I was to receive a china set I had been eating off of since I was 6 years old. I looked at my brother. He was watching me with the focused attention of a man who has anticipated a specific response and is calibrating based on what he sees. I picked up my keys. I didn't raise my voice, didn't ask another question, didn't give the man in the sport coat anything to write in his legal pad. I drove back to Dayton and sat in my car in the parking garage for 19 minutes before I went upstairs. Here is what I knew. My father had been meticulous about two things across his entire life: money and paper. He balanced his checkbook in pencil every Friday without exception. He kept every receipt organized by category and year in a shoebox system that went back to 1987. He had shown me his original will in 2018, a document drawn up by Gerald Fitch, an estate attorney in Salina who had handled 3 generations of farm transfers in Mercer County. That will, the one I had sat across the table from my father and read line by line, had divided the farm and savings equally between Daniel and me, with the farmhouse held in trust for 5 years and then offered for sale with proceeds split. Equal. Dad had used that word twice. Equal means something to a man who grew up sharing one coat between 4 children. The document Daniel had placed on the table was notarized in Dayton. Gerald Fitch's name was not on it. The notary was someone I had never heard of. The date was March of 2021, 6 months after Dad's first major cardiac episode, when he had been on 3 new medications and spent 11 days in the hospital, 2 of them in the cardiac intensive care unit. 6 months after the worst period of his physical life. 6 months after a period during which Daniel had visited exactly once, for 3 days, and had taken Dad to lunch at the Applebee's on Route 29 and called it quality time. I did not sleep well that night. I pulled Dad's address book from my bag. I'd taken it from the house the day after he died, a reflex, the same instinct that had made me photograph his medical chart before I handed it to the hospice agency. Gerald Fitch's number was behind the F tab, written in my father's handwriting in blue ballpoint, the same careful print he used for everything that mattered. I called first thing Friday morning. Gerald Fitch answered on the 3rd ring. He said Dad's name the way people say the name of someone they genuinely respected, as if goodness is a quality worth noting aloud. "Mr. Fitch," I said, "I'm calling because my brother has produced a will I've never seen. Notarized in Dayton, March 2021. It leaves the entire estate to him. I have never seen this document before today." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ms. Calloway, before we go further, did your father give you anything to hold for him? An envelope, perhaps? In the last year or so?" My throat tightened. I went very still. "No," I said. "He didn't give me anything to hold." Another pause, longer. Then, "When can you come to my office?" I said Friday. He said that would be fine, and that I should bring identification, and that there were some things we needed to discuss in person. He said nothing else. I hung up and sat in my kitchen in the particular silence that follows a sentence you don't yet understand but know is going to change something. My father had been many things, but he was not a man who rewrote 40 years of careful intention because of a conversation with someone who arrived in a new car and smelled like an airport. He was not a man who looked his daughter in the eye and said equal and then changed his mind without a word. He was not a man who went to a notary he'd never used before, 6 months after a near-fatal cardiac episode, and handed everything to the child who called on Sundays and borrowed money that was never repaid. Something else existed. Gerald Fitch had asked me about an envelope. That meant Gerald Fitch knew something. That meant my father had told him something, or given him something, or asked him to hold something, something he had not trusted to the kitchen table and the manila folder and the man in the sport coat whose name Daniel had never bothered to say out loud. 5 days after my brother stood in my father's kitchen and told 30 people that Raymond Calloway had left him everything, the extended family had already begun to move. It happened in the way it always happens in families where one person is louder and more present and more comfortable claiming space, gradually, and then all at once. Daniel had called our Aunt Patricia in Columbus by Wednesday evening, the night after he showed me the will. He had called our cousin Marcus, who had always admired Daniel the way younger men admire older ones who seem effortlessly successful. He had called our father's neighbor, Frank Idle, who had farmed the adjacent land for 30 years and cared deeply about what would become of the Harlan Road property. By Thursday afternoon, when Daniel was sitting across from me at the kitchen table with the manila envelope and the man in the sport coat, he had already told his version of the story to at least 6 people who mattered. I knew this because my phone had started ringing Wednesday night. Aunt Patricia, who wanted to express how difficult this must be and also ask whether I intended to contest anything, because contesting a will was messy and Gerald had clearly known his own mind. Marcus, who said he thought Daniel had handled everything with real grace under the circumstances. Frank Idle, who asked, quietly and without malice, whether I planned to sell the land. Not Frank too, I thought. Dad had farmed alongside Frank Idle for 20 years. The idea that Frank was already thinking about a sale meant Daniel had already mentioned the possibility to him, which meant Daniel had been planning well before my father's body was cold. I did not return any of the calls. I made a list instead: names, dates of contact, what each person had been told. It is the reflex of someone who works in numbers. When something doesn't add up, you document before you confront. You build the record first and the argument second. I had been building financial records for other people's complicated situations for 11 years. I knew what a paper trail was for. What I didn't know yet, what I would not know until I sat across from Gerald Fitch in his office in Salina and he reached into the bottom drawer of his desk and placed something on the table between us, was that my father had been building his own paper trail. Quietly, carefully, in the way Raymond Calloway did everything that truly mattered to him. He had been building it for 2 years. And he had known, with the instinct of a man who spent 4 decades reading land and weather and the particular kind of silence that precedes something coming, exactly who was going to need it. I drove to Salina on Friday morning. The fields along Route 29 were bare in February, the soil dark and flat under a gray sky. I had made this drive 100 times to bring Dad to appointments, to pick up supplies from the co-op, to sit in the Mercer County Courthouse and help him review property tax documents. I knew every turn. I had always known this land better than Daniel did, because I had never left it. Gerald Fitch's office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building on the town square. The receptionist showed me in without making me wait. Gerald Fitch was approximately 70, compact and unhurried, with the kind of eyes that have seen enough versions of the same story to be genuinely interested in a new one. He shook my hand. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. He did not waste time. "Your father came to see me 14 months ago," he said. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and placed something on the surface between us. A white envelope, sealed, my father's handwriting across the front. 2 words. My name. Gerald Fitch did not touch the envelope. He left it on the desk between us and folded his hands and looked at me the way an attorney looks at someone when he wants to let the object in the room do the talking before any words are necessary. "Your father came to see me 14 months ago," he said. "October of 2022. He called ahead, which he never did. Your father was a walk-in man, always had been, 30 years of showing up without an appointment. But that October he called 3 days ahead. He said he had something that needed to be done correctly and he wanted to make sure I had enough time." I looked at the envelope. My father's handwriting. The letters even and deliberate, the slight lean in the capital N that I had been reading my whole life on birthday cards and Christmas envelopes, and the notes he tucked into my lunch bag until I was old enough to feel embarrassed about it. "Nora," it said. Just my name. Nothing else on the front. Gerald Fitch reached into the same drawer and produced a second document, this one not in an envelope but in a manila folder, the kind with the red string closure that law offices use for things they want kept organized and intact. He set the folder beside the envelope. He didn't open it yet. "I need to explain something first," he said. "When your father came to me in October 2022, he was specific about what he wanted and why. He had become aware, in the months prior, that a document existed, a document he had not authored in any meaningful way, that purported to represent his final wishes. He could not prove at the time exactly how that document had come to exist. But he knew what was in it because he had been asked to review it, and he had not agreed to review it under circumstances he was comfortable describing as entirely voluntary." He used different words than I'm using now, Gerald Fitch added. He was a plain-spoken man. But that was the substance of it. I kept my hand still in my lap. Gerald Fitch opened the manila folder. Inside was a will. Properly executed, properly witnessed, bearing Gerald Fitch's notary stamp and the date of October 14, 2022, 19 months after the document Daniel had placed on my father's kitchen table. The document was 3 pages. It named me, Nora Jean Calloway, as the sole beneficiary of the Harlan Road property, all associated land and structures, both savings accounts, and the Union Pension and Retirement Fund. It named Gerald Fitch as executor. At the bottom of the second page, below my father's signature, were 2 witness signatures. Gerald Fitch's name in his own hand. And below it, Francis Paul Idle. Frank. My father's neighbor of 30 years, the man who farmed the adjacent land, the man Daniel had called the week of the funeral to mention the possibility of a sale. Frank Idle had witnessed my father's true will 19 months ago and had never said a word to anyone. He had listened to Daniel's phone call about selling the land and still said nothing. Because my father had asked him to wait. I sat in Gerald Fitch's office for a long time after that. He answered my questions in the careful, unhurried way of a man who is prepared for a conversation he knew was eventually coming. Dad had understood, Gerald Fitch explained, that the earlier document, the one produced in Dayton in March of 2021, was something he had been maneuvered into signing during a period when his medications had been recently adjusted and his cognitive state, while not compromised in any permanent sense, had been vulnerable in ways that made him susceptible to a kind of pressure he did not fully recognize as pressure until later. He could not have challenged it at the time. He didn't have the energy or the documentation. So instead he had done the thing Raymond Calloway always did when the situation required patience. He waited. He recovered. And 14 months before he died, when he knew his time was becoming finite, he drove himself to Salina and asked Gerald Fitch to help him make it right. The envelope on the desk was separate from the will, Gerald Fitch said. It was not part of the legal document. It was personal. He had been instructed to give it to me directly, without opening it, and only if I came to the office in person and asked about the estate. He had been waiting for my call. He had known it would come. I picked up the envelope. I did not open it there. I put it in my bag and I thanked Gerald Fitch and I walked down the stairs and out onto the town square and I sat on a bench in the February cold and I held the bag on my lap and I breathed for a while before I could open it. The letter inside was 2 pages, handwritten on the lined yellow paper Dad used for notes he considered important. The handwriting was slower than I remembered, the letters wider spaced, the pressure lighter, the hand of a man whose grip had become careful over the last year of his life. He began by saying he was sorry. Not in the way people say sorry when they want to be forgiven quickly, but in the way that means I have thought about this every day and the weight of it has been with me the whole time. He said he knew what had happened in March of 2021 and he knew who had arranged it and he was ashamed that he had not protected me from it sooner. He said, "You have never once asked me for anything that wasn't already yours. I should have told you that while I could still say it out loud." He said the farm was mine and had always been mine in the way that things belong to the person who tends them. He said he knew I would know what to do. He said he loved me. He signed it Dad, not Raymond, not Father, just Dad, the way he had signed everything he meant entirely. I sat on that bench in Salina for 22 minutes. Then I went home and I called the only person I trusted to help me think through what came next. Her name was Vivian Park. We had worked together at the firm for 9 years. She was a forensic accountant who spent her professional life untangling financial documents that had been deliberately obscured, and she was the person I called when I needed someone who could look at a complicated situation and strip it down to what was actually true. I told her everything. The will Daniel had produced. The March 2021 date. The Dayton notary. The fact that Dad had been 6 months out of a cardiac hospitalization when he signed it. Gerald Fitch's October 2022 document with its proper witnesses and its 19-month advantage over Daniel's version. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Nora, the 2021 document may not just be invalid. Depending on what your father was told and how that signing was arranged, it may be fraudulent. That changes everything about how this gets handled." She referred me to an estate litigation attorney named Carol Marsh, based in Dayton, who Vivian described as someone who did not lose cases involving forged or coerced testamentary documents because she understood that the financial record around a will tells a story the document itself cannot always tell. I called Carol Marsh that afternoon. I had an appointment by Thursday. Meanwhile, Daniel was moving. I was watching it happen from a distance in real time, the way you watch weather forming on the horizon before it reaches you. He had contacted a commercial real estate developer based in Toledo about the Harlan Road land, 47 acres of farmland 20 minutes from the county seat, the kind of parcel that interests developers building distribution centers and logistics facilities. I know this because Frank Idle called me. He called the Saturday after I visited Gerald Fitch, and his voice had the quality of a man who has been carrying something he should have put down earlier. "Nora," he said, "I need to tell you something. Daniel came out here on Thursday. He walked the fence line with a man who had blueprints. I told him he needed to talk to you first. He said the estate was settled and the property was his to manage. I said I didn't think that was right. He said he appreciated my concern. Then he took photographs of my eastern boundary markers." Frank paused. "Your daddy asked me to wait and let things happen the way they were supposed to happen. I've been waiting. But I think it's time I stopped waiting." I told him everything I'd found. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Good. Tell me what you need me to do." Carol Marsh reviewed both documents side by side on a Monday morning in her office in downtown Dayton. She was methodical and unhurried, and she did not editorialize. She laid the March 2021 will and the October 2022 will on her desk, and she went through each one with the focused attention of someone who has done this enough times to know exactly where to look. The 2021 document, she noted, bore the notary stamp of an individual who had been employed by a firm in Cincinnati with connections to a commercial property development company. The same firm, she showed me, that had handled the legal paperwork for 2 of Daniel's investment properties in the prior 3 years. The notary had a professional relationship with my brother. The notary had certified my father's signature on a document that represented a fundamental reversal of 30 years of stated intention, produced 6 months after a cardiac hospitalization, with no independent counsel present and no witnesses beyond the notary herself. Carol Marsh looked up from the documents. She said, with the precision of someone choosing each word individually, "This is not going to hold." The estate meeting was scheduled for the following Friday. Gerald Fitch's office had sent formal notice to Daniel as the named executor of the March 2021 document, advising him that a competing testamentary instrument had been identified and that all parties with a claimed interest in the estate of Raymond Calloway were invited to attend a meeting to review both documents. Daniel's response came through an attorney he had hired in Cincinnati, a man named Blaine Foster, whose firm handled business litigation and who had, based on his website, never once appeared in an estate proceeding in his career. Daniel's letter, through Blaine Foster, stated that his client was confident in the validity of the March 2021 will and would attend the meeting to clarify any confusion. Confusion. That was the word they chose. I want you to think about that word for a second, because I thought about it for 3 days. Confusion implies an honest misunderstanding. Confusion implies that 2 people are looking at the same thing and seeing it differently. What Daniel and Blaine Foster were calling confusion was my father's true wishes, properly witnessed and notarized by a man he had trusted for 30 years, sealed in an envelope with my name on it, held in a drawer for 14 months. That is not confusion. That is a man making sure the truth survived him. If you've ever watched someone try to rewrite what a person you loved actually wanted, you know exactly how that word lands. Drop a comment below and tell me. Because this story is about to reach the moment my father prepared for, and my brother never saw coming. Daniel arrived at Gerald Fitch's office on Friday at 10 in the morning with Blaine Foster and a confidence that had the quality of something rehearsed. He was dressed the way he dressed for business, the blazer, the dark trousers, the watch he had started wearing after the Cincinnati firm had its first good year. He nodded at me across the waiting room the way you nod at someone you've already decided is not a problem. Carol Marsh sat beside me. She had a folder on her lap that she had not opened. Gerald Fitch came out and shook hands with everyone and led us into the conference room, which had a long table and 6 chairs and windows that looked out over the town square where I had sat on a bench 3 weeks earlier holding my father's letter. Aunt Patricia was there. She had driven from Columbus because Gerald Fitch's notice had mentioned competing documents and she had decided that meant she needed to be present. She sat on Daniel's side of the table without seeming to realize she had made a choice. Frank Idle was there also, at Gerald's invitation, as a witness to the October 2022 document. He sat on my side without hesitation. Marcus, our cousin, had declined to attend. I had not expected him to come. Gerald Fitch opened the meeting by presenting both documents in chronological order. The March 2021 will first, the October 2022 will second. He did not editorialize. He simply placed them on the table and identified them by date and described the circumstances of each document's creation based on his direct knowledge. Blaine Foster interrupted twice to clarify that his client disputed the validity of any document produced after March 2021 on the grounds that Raymond Calloway's cognitive capacity had been declining and that the October 2022 instrument may have been produced under undue influence. I looked at Frank Idle when Foster said undue influence. Frank's jaw tightened. He had been one of the 2 witnesses. He had sat beside my father in this same building 14 months ago and watched him sign his name in his own hand with full and articulate explanation of his wishes. Daniel, to his left, was nodding along with everything Foster said. He had the manner of a man who believes that conviction and volume can do what evidence cannot. He had been the most persuasive person in every room he'd ever entered. He had talked his way into investors and out of losses and around inconvenient facts for 20 years. He believed this room would be the same. He leaned back in his chair. He gestured at the October 2022 document with one hand, a dismissive motion, the kind you use to wave away something without touching it. "Look," he said, "Dad was not well. Anyone who spent time with him in the last 2 years knows his judgment was compromised. I was protecting the estate. I was protecting him." The room was quiet. Gerald Fitch looked at his hands. Carol Marsh opened her folder. Frank Idle looked directly at Daniel for the first time since we'd sat down. I spoke for the first time in that meeting. I had not said a word in 40 minutes. My voice was even. "I was protecting him," I said. I repeated my brother's exact words back to him, the same 4 words, the same rhythm. The room shifted. Aunt Patricia, who had been nodding gently since we sat down, stopped nodding. I reached into the folder Carol Marsh had placed on the table and I removed the document she had prepared, a certified analysis of the March 2021 will, the notary's professional relationship with Daniel's Cincinnati firm, the absence of independent legal counsel, the date relative to my father's hospitalization, and the signature comparison between the March 2021 document and my father's known authentic signatures on file with the county recorder's office going back 15 years. I set it on the center of the table. Then I removed the second document, my father's letter. The 2-page handwritten letter on yellow-lined paper, with the photocopied image of my name on the sealed envelope it had arrived in. I placed them beside the analysis. "You were in Cincinnati," I said. I said it without accusation, without volume, the way you state a fact that requires no additional support. "You were in Cincinnati for 8 months while Dad went to cardiac rehabilitation 3 times a week. You were in Cincinnati when his potassium levels dropped in August of 2021, and Drive Osei changed his medications and I drove to Mercer County on a Tuesday night because he sounded wrong on the phone. You were in Cincinnati when the October 2022 document was witnessed, when Dad drove himself to this office and sat across from Gerald Fitch and Frank Idle and told them exactly what he wanted and why. He told them why, Daniel. Do you want to know what he said?" Daniel's jaw was set. His hands were flat on the table. Blaine Foster put a hand on his arm. "Daniel," the attorney said quietly. "Daniel." I watched my brother decide not to speak. I watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, The same calculation I had watched happen at the kitchen table when he was 12 and had broken something and was deciding how much to admit. He had always known when to retreat. Carol Marsh spoke then. She addressed Gerald Fitch directly, as though Daniel and Blaine Foster were furniture. The October 2022 instrument is valid, properly executed, and takes precedence over the March 2021 document as the more recently dated expression of the testator's wishes. The March 2021 document presents significant questions of circumstance that, if pursued, would result in a contested probate proceeding that my client is prepared to initiate. However, the evidentiary record, the notary's professional connection to Daniel Calloway, the absence of independent counsel, the timing relative to Mr. Calloway's hospitalization, and the existence of a properly witnessed superseding document, makes the outcome of any contest essentially predictable. She paused. I'd recommend we save everyone the time. The room was silent except for the sound of the clock on Gerald Fitch's wall, which I had not noticed until that moment. Aunt Patricia was looking at the letter. The handwritten one on yellow paper. She was looking at it the way you look at something you recognize. My father's handwriting. She had known that handwriting for 50 years. She pressed her lips together. Frank Idle sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, the way people do when they are trying not to show the full extent of what they are feeling. Daniel stood up. The chair scraped. The sound was too sudden for the quiet in the room. This isn't over, he said. Blaine Foster stood also, gathering papers. This is not the appropriate venue, Foster said, for a decision of this magnitude. We'll be in touch. I looked at my brother. He was standing with his hands at his sides, the blazer slightly crooked, the watch catching the light from the window. He looked, for the first time since I could remember, like someone who had run out of room to negotiate. Like someone standing at the edge of something he had not calculated the depth of. I thought he would leave without another word. Instead he looked at me, and his voice was lower than it had been all morning, stripped of the polished reasonableness he had worn like the blazer. Dad loved me too, he said. I know, I told him. He built you a $37,000 loan you never paid back and a photograph on a refrigerator and 40 years of Sunday phone calls that you returned when you felt like it. He loved you. I paused. He just knew who would stay. Daniel left with Foster behind him. The door closed. Aunt Patricia sat very still with her hands in her lap. Frank Idle exhaled through his nose, a long slow breath, and looked at me with the expression of a man who has finally set something down that had been heavy. Gerald Fitch gathered the documents and capped his pen and said, quietly and without ceremony, we'll begin probate on the October instrument Monday morning. The contested probate proceeding Daniel filed lasted 11 weeks. Blaine Foster submitted a formal challenge citing undue influence and diminished capacity, the same language from the meeting, and Carol Marsh answered it with the complete evidentiary record, the notary's documented professional ties to Daniel, the cardiologist's certified statement that my father's cognitive function had been assessed as unimpaired through his final months, the witness testimony of both Gerald Fitch and Frank Idle, and a handwriting analysis confirming that the signatures on both documents were my father's authentic hand, which made the March 2021 will not a forgery exactly, but a document obtained under conditions that made it legally indefensible. The probate court ruled in favor of the October 2022 instrument on a Tuesday afternoon in early May. I was at my desk at the firm when Carol Marsh called. She said 3 words, "It's yours, Nora." I put the phone down and looked at my keyboard for a long time. Daniel did not call. He had discharged Blaine Foster 2 weeks before the ruling, the retainer had run out and the firm declined to continue on credit. The Toledo developer never received a signed agreement because the property was in contested probate and no executor had authority to negotiate a sale. By the time the ruling came through, the developer had moved on to a parcel in Wyandotte County. 47 acres on Harlan Road were still farmland. The way my father had always intended them to be. Aunt Patricia called me the evening of the ruling. She was quiet for a moment at the start of the call, the particular quiet of someone who is deciding whether to acknowledge what they already know. Then she said, "Your father was a smart man. He knew what he was doing." "I think I did too," I told her. We stayed on the phone for another 40 minutes, talking about things that had nothing to do with the estate, her garden, the price of heating oil, a movie she'd seen that she thought I'd like. It was the longest conversation we'd had in years. It was, in its quiet way, an apology. I accepted it in the same spirit it was offered, without naming what it was. The farmhouse on Harlan Road transferred to my name on a Wednesday in June. Gerald Fitch had the deed recorded at the county courthouse, and his office mailed me a certified copy. I held it in my hands in my apartment in Dayton and read my name on the line where my father's name had been for 42 years. I had spent 11 years building records for other people's financial lives, tracking their assets, organizing their numbers, making sure the things they owned were represented correctly on paper. I had never once had a document that said mine in quite this way. This was 47 acres and a farmhouse and a kitchen where I knew every drawer, a front porch where I had sat every summer of my life, a workshop behind the barn where my father had kept tools he had used for 4 decades. It was mine because he had made it mine. And it had stayed mine because I had learned, from the same man who built it, that the most important thing you can do with the truth is protect it until the moment it's needed. The first thing I did after the deed transferred was drive to Harlan Road and sit on the front porch for an hour without going inside. It was a Wednesday evening in June, warm enough that the fireflies had started coming up from the grass along the fence line, the way they always did in the summers the first grew up in that yard. I hadn't lived on Harlan Road since I was 22. But I knew the sound of that porch, the particular creak of the third board from the door, the way the wind came through the oak tree at the southwest corner and made the same low sound it had been making since before I was born. I sat in my father's chair, the wooden rocker he had repaired himself 3 times rather than replace, and I watched the fireflies come up from the grass and I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not the legal victory, not the numbers, not the $681,000 now held in my name. The weight of my father trusting me enough to seal a letter in an envelope and put my name on it and leave it in a drawer with a man he had known for 30 years. That weight is different from anything else. It is not light. It is not supposed to be. I did not rush into decisions about the farm. I had spent 11 years watching clients make expensive choices too quickly in the aftermath of inherited property, and I had learned that the first instinct is almost never the right one. I took 2 months. I walked the 47 acres 4 times in those months, sometimes with Frank Idle, who knew the land the way my father had, and once alone in late July when the corn on the neighboring fields was high and the air smelled like everything summer is supposed to smell like when you are somewhere you belong. I talked to Carol Marsh about the estate's financial structure. I talked to Vivian about the tax implications. I made a spreadsheet, because I always make a spreadsheet, and I looked at it for a long time before I made any decisions at all. What I decided was this. The farmhouse would be kept. I would not sell it and I would not rent it immediately. I would spend the fall doing the repairs my father had deferred in his last 2 years, the back porch boards, the roof over the kitchen addition, the windows on the north side that had never sealed properly. I hired a contractor from Salina named Gus Hartman, who had worked with my father on 2 projects 20 years ago and who said, when I called him, that he had wondered when somebody was going to call about those windows. I kept my apartment in Dayton for the time being because the farmhouse was not yet ready and because I had learned enough from watching other people's lives to know that decisions made in the middle of grief should have room to breathe. But I spent weekends on Harlan Road. I slept in the same narrow guest bed and drank coffee on the same front porch and listened to the same oak tree in the southwest corner, and each time I left on Sunday evening it was a little harder to go. The savings accounts and the retirement fund, after estate taxes and Carol Marsh's fees, which were considerable but entirely worth every dollar, left me with a net inheritance of approximately $540,000. I did not spend it quickly. I moved it into accounts I managed myself, structured the way I would structure a client's assets, diversified, conservative, building toward something rather than shrinking toward nothing. I set aside $37,000 in a separate account. I labeled it in my spreadsheet the way I labeled everything that mattered, clearly, so there would be no confusion later. It was the amount of the loan my father had made to Daniel in 2003, with interest. I did not give it to Daniel. But I held it separately from everything else, because my father had intended for his estate to be divided equally, and I had not forgotten what equal meant to a man who grew up with nothing. I was not ready to decide what to do with it. I am still not entirely sure. Some things need more time than other things, and that is one of them. Daniel did not contest the probate ruling. He had no grounds left and no attorney willing to pursue it. The last I heard through a mutual cousin was that he had restructured his Cincinnati firm significantly. 2 of his 4 investment properties had been sold to cover debts that had accumulated during the months he spent focused on the estate rather than his own business. He drives a different car now. I don't know which one. I have not spoken to him since the conference room at Gerald Fitch's office, when he stood with his hands at his sides and told me this wasn't over. It has been over. He knows it. I think, on some level, he has known it since the moment he heard Gerald Fitch's name on the phone and understood that there was a man in Salina who had been holding something for 14 months. That is when the certainty must have cracked. That is when he must have understood that our father had been paying attention all along. I think about my father often, in the particular way you think about someone you cannot ask the questions you should have asked earlier. I think about him driving himself to Salina in October of 2022, the way he always drove, both hands on the wheel, speed exactly at the limit, no faster. I think about him sitting across from Gerald Fitch and explaining with his plain-spoken clarity what he needed and why, and then watching Gerald Fitch notarize the document with Frank Idle standing beside him, and then handing over the sealed white envelope with my name on it and asking them to wait. I think about what it costs a man like my father to ask for help. To trust someone else with something that matters that much. He drove himself home afterward and made dinner and balanced his checkbook on Friday and never said a word to me about any of it, because he believed I wouldn't need to know until I needed to know. He was right. He was almost always right about the things he didn't say out loud. What I lost through all of this is harder to account for than what I gained. I lost the version of my brother that existed before the Lexus and the Blazer and the manila envelope. The version who used to make my father's shoulders shake with laughter at the kitchen table. I do not know with any certainty whether that person still exists somewhere inside the man who walked out of Gerald Fitch's conference room without looking at me. I hope he does. I cannot build anything on a hope I cannot verify. I have not tried to contact Daniel and he has not tried to contact me. The door is not locked. It is simply closed, and closing it was the first honest decision I made entirely on my own terms. Frank Idle still farms the adjacent land. We have coffee on the porch sometimes on Saturday mornings, the way he and my father used to, and he tells me things about the property that I didn't know, which sections drain slowly after rain, where the fence posts along the eastern line need replacing, which corner of the back acreage my father had been meaning to reseed for 3 years and never gotten to. He tells me these things the way he told my father, as one neighbor to another, as though the knowledge of a piece of land belongs to the people who tend it and should be passed along accordingly. I am learning. I am slower than my father was and I know less, but I am learning. I moved to Harlan Road permanently in October. The back porch boards were finished in September and the kitchen roof the week after, and the north windows finally sealed against the cold for the first time in years. I drove a load of boxes out on a Saturday morning when the oak tree had gone gold and the fields across the road had been harvested down to stubble, and I carried them through the front door one at a time and put them in the rooms where they belonged. The farmhouse is not perfect. The water heater makes a sound in the basement. The third porch board still creaks. I have not fixed that one and I do not intend to. Some things should stay exactly as they are. Some mornings I sit at the kitchen table with my coffee and I look at the chair across from me, the one at the head of the table, the one my father sat in for 42 years, and I think about the word he used when he showed me his original will. Equal. He said it twice. I understand now that equal was not just a description of what he intended to give us. It was a description of what he believed about us, before the years and the distance and the choices made it harder to see. He believed that both of his children deserved everything he had to give. He just understood, at the end, that only one of them had stayed close enough to receive it. Your name belongs to you. What was built for you belongs to you. And when someone tries to take what was meant to be yours, the most powerful thing you can do is exactly what my father did. Document everything, trust the right people, and be patient enough to let the truth arrive in its own time. Because it will. It always does. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen right now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. See you in the next story.